even though I've had those Kundalini experiences from that point on for about 15 or 18 years, they came constantly in various forms, various times. Never really explained. And now for 15 years or more, I don't have any experience like that at this point. And I guess that was my first question was, what happens when when the Kundalini Shakti is established, you actually feel it anymore. I had so many various experiences of it, in listening to the Vedas being chanted, to waking up at 5 a.m. First the witnessing came, the white light came, and then the Kundalini would come during naps or various times in meditation, receiving advanced techniques, especially when I received from Maharishi himself. I had the same Kundalini experience. And then it all kind of ceased. And I guess I've kind of lived a very kind of ordinary life. The significance of that explosion of that pearl, it didn't really make me a spiritual adept. I kind of went on and had a very ordinary, simple life. And yet I've experienced a lot of transformation over the years, but always on a quiet level. And so I'm just curious if you might comment on that. We talked about the other day that Maharishi consciously stopped talking about Kundalini in the 1960s somewhere. And so when I was having these experiences, there was literally no one to talk to about them. And I had to sort of read a book, and didn't really help that much, but just to even understand the term and what was happening. But there was actually nobody, and I guess I'm curious. It wasn't my karma to have someone explain it to me, but just curious if the significance of all that would ever been explained, would I have enjoyed that experience in a deeper way or gotten some benefit from the intellectual understanding of it. And I think I just may add one more point. I think obviously the experience that I had at that time and way back when I was 20 years old, I realized that it was from the grace of being with Maharishi. And I also realized that I always felt afterwards that somehow Maharishi was always giving out that grace, but people around him weren't able to tap into it or something. And for some reason I was in a very innocent state when I sat there with him, and it was just I think it was purely just my innocence or something, and then the grace was received. I could never have had that experience on my own, but once it happened that one time, then it happened spontaneously many, many times over almost 20 years.
Well, that part is, it's rather well known when U.G. Krishnamurti, not the Jiddu Krishnamurti, U.J. Krishnamurti, another spiritual teacher who lived at the same time, that was of a younger generation a bit. When he came to Ramana Maharshi, he quite buoyantly asked, "Can you give that to me, what you have?" And Ramana Maharshi looked in his direction and said, "Yes, I can give it to you, but can you take it?" It's a great example and great exchange. Of course, U.J. Krishnamurti never stayed with Ramana Maharshi. He was very annoyed and disappointed. It's also very well documented. And he was destined to become teacher in his own right. And he is also known as the angry Krishnamurti. There was this Jiddu Krishnamurti was the one who talked a lot. And U.J. Krishnamurti had that nickname as the angry one. And both of them actually also funny enough, we're aware of each other. And so this whole thing about, I can give it to you, but can you take it, is very well known. How grace is there, and indeed an adept can impart that grace. So it's not just all has to happen automatically, or it has nothing to do with what in the field of, in the non-dual circles very often seen as, how can there be any giver and receiver, because this reducing reality to the dualistic point of view. And there's a giver and receiver, and there is a doer. So, but this is simply missing the point that every level of reality, has corresponding laws and levels of consciousness and so forth. So of course, at this phenomenal level of reality, there is a giver and there is a receiver, like in normal circumstances. Yes, one can have a Christmas gift and receive it and being very grateful to the people who gave that gift, whilst internally being grateful to Santa Claus. Right? It doesn't hurt to say thank you for a gift, whilst maybe chanting Santa Claus mantra at the same time, and kind of like, what a lovely, old man, so generous. And just nodding towards those who gave you the actual gift, like, yeah. There's so many different attitudes that we can have in life. So that part is, we can, of course, yes, that ability to take what is given. One can receive an amazing gift. But what if the nature of the gift is such that one would need to know what to do with that gift? This opens up another story here, opens up another line of possibilities. But to make it simple, what you have shared is a very beautiful experience of that descent of grace. And it's very clearly, it's an experience, authentic experience of awakening. It's not experience of self-realization, it's experience of awakening, which is accompanied by this phenomena of the awakening itself can be experienced as that overwhelming sensation of being taken over by this greater power. And this is why there are many people who mistake awakening for self-realization and speak about it as the self is being realized. The self is never realized in any phantasmagoric or spectacular event. It's a very quiet affair. And we will lead to that, because in the core of your question, as far as I understood, contains, once, as you have put it, once Kundalini is established, is there any possibility for any experience pertinent to the Kundalini process? Well, so if this is somehow suffice to quench your curiosity, that encounter and that what was received as that great gift, being in the presence of a holy man, being in the presence of the whole tradition, being in the presence of the whole wave of consciousness, because we cannot extricate and make it into our own individually pocketed experience, right? It was, there are waves upon waves of awakening taking place in the society, in the collective consciousness. And some of us become instruments of that. Clearly, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was larger than life because he was that instrument of the divine. As he very often spoke about it in a very humble way, as it is spoken in that given tradition, always with reference to one's spiritual perceptor, and at times, as we know also, with reference to the guidance received from the Divine Mother. That guidance received from the Divine Mother, this intimate encounters that, interestingly enough, not even widely known among the followers of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, TMS, that these encounters that he had were filled with the purpose of what Maharishi is to carry and would carry through. This, of course, encounters with Mother Divine is an internal experiences of direct cognition and the power of Kundalini, a fully awakened force, which brings about this total realignment. But to make it accessible in that letter that Maharishi wrote, that letter which exists even in his own handwriting, where he speaks about that experience in the cave, experience with Mother Divine, is not experience of some kind of dual in nature being in the presence of some apparition or visitation. It is given that, if you will, it's given to form, accessible form, so that others can relate to that. Very often this is the case. Some spiritual teachers are more unapologetic in their discourse. Like Ramana Maharshi, he was a tough one. In a way, he would never have any, if you will, any what's the term when one goes from the perspective which is one way or the other inferior? He will never have that concession. No, more like a concession. He would not go to the level of concession, you know. So what, you know, like this famous exchanges exemplified in, you know, like, you know, he'll be asked, Bhagwan, what to do about others, you know. I'm constantly bothered about others, you know. Well, there are no others. This is it. Swallow that. There are no others, right? So, of course, so he was notorious, and his way of teaching was very much unapologetic and direct, and he could afford that because he didn't need to convert Westerners into spiritual way of life. He belonged to the group of sages who sit in the same place, right? All sages fall into category. Even that is categorized in this culture. You know, those who wander around, mixed in the crowd, those who sit in one place and people come to them, and those who become worldly leaders, they move around, create spiritual empires. And there are those who simply merge back into the crowd with no distinction whatsoever. So, now, what about the process itself? See, the intensity of that descent of grace has its velocity, power, it has its lasting power as well. It is also very well known that another contemporary of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, Swami Muktananda, who was known for a more direct way of imparting Shaktipat, that was like unapologetically visceral, right? That this was done often on an ongoing basis. So in other words, it's not like one received just one Shaktipat and that completes the job. So his students, disciples, followers would seek his company to get, if you will, plugged into that powerful field again and again. So I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to draw any conclusions of the way it is unfolded in your case. But as you said yourself, that didn't turn you into an adept, instead you lived life that you we're supposed to live, and the rest is left to speculation. What might have happened if, instead you would have been in the presence of Maharishi more often and get zapped each time you're there, then maybe that whole thing of family never would have happened to you, right? It's open to speculation, right? It would not even dawn on you. You'll be so zapped you wouldn't even know how to court K and how to get, you wouldn't have enough energy to do that. Run business, all the things you've done. We don't know. I'm clueless. I'm just sitting talking now something. It's not even really happening. It's just something in response to what you brought. So, what really, what are we doing here? What are we dealing here with? Can Kundalini establish itself and we no longer feel it? Well, first of all, we might need to be introduced to the varieties of ways of how this could take place, even in terms of what is seen as the culmination of that process. Because even here, there are distinctively different perspectives. At some time, I've introduced this, what I've simply stumbled upon, reading a few years ago, that in India, and of course it probably can only happen in India today because India guards very attentively everything to do with its spiritual heritage, right? There is a university in Varanasi, right? It's a philosophical university where great scholars go to study spiritual disciplines, Sanskrit, language of the Vedas, right? So there was this excerpt I stumbled upon maybe 6-7 years ago. This was upon Maharishi's departure. It was definitely after 2008. And I read there that as the 20th century ended and we've entered this present millennium, the studies in India and to kind of archiving the work and achievement of these more outstanding spiritual figures that came from India in the last 100 years. They defined 4 different perspectives on enlightenment, exemplified by the teachings of someone like Paramahamsa, Ramakrishna or Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, that of Sri Aurobindo, that of Ramana Maharshi, and that of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Why? Because each of these figures were considered to be reaching the mark of that, what is called, even on the standard of Indian, let's say, scale of what it really represents, as becoming the epitome of what each respective tradition here gives. And each one of them had slightly different way in relation to what is considered to be the leading factor and what is considered to be culminating as what could be called enlightenment. So it's 4 perspectives on enlightenment already were given in the examination of the teachings of these 4 masters who lived not all in the same time. We know that Ramakrishna Paramahamsa lived much earlier, and so is Sri Aurobindo, and then Ramana Maharshi, and then Maharishi Mahesh Yogi closer to our time. Even that gives us this kind of, if you will, different perspectives on what could be seen here as the summit and what leads to the summit and what that summit represents. Because there are unique aspects For example, in the teachings of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, and by the way, awakening of life force is applicable to all of them. It's just Maharishi Mahesh Yogi decided to replace it with another term. It's not correct to say that he did not talk about Kundalini. He just replaced it with cosmic consciousness. And if you hear Maharishi's tapes, cosmic consciousness is the most commonly used term. Remember somewhere he said cosmic consciousness is a prerequisite. How many times he said cosmic consciousness is a must, whether we live unity here or not, but cosmic consciousness is our given opportunity, it's a given gift, it's already a birthright. You remember that?
Yes, sure.
What does it mean? It means that having lived awakened life is a birthright. Whether this will culminate in God, let alone unity, is another story. And Maharishi was also very, he was quite relaxed about it. I never seen him with a whip running after the TMers to bring them up to the unity consciousness. So just hold that thought. So when we see these four masters, none of them dismissed, everyone understood and knew directly through first-hand experience that what facilitates and brings this transformation of consciousness about is always awakening of life force. True to the Ramakrishna, true to the Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, true to the Ramana Maharshi, which is, by the way, repeatedly ignored by non-dualists and neo-Advaitins. Repeatedly ignored. They ignore this because they do not want to even study the works of Ramana Maharshi in full scope. But the difference, for instance, in the understanding of someone like Ramakrishna and someone like Ramana Maharshi is that Ramakrishna spoke and exalted that very yogic way where the culmination of all processes take place in Sahasrara, where all the discourses were essentially exalting that truth. It is the place of where the union of Shiva Shakti takes place. The union of Shiva Shakti takes place in Sahasrara, in the abode where Shakti and Shiva reunite. Ramana Maharshi was not that quick on that. Ramana Maharshi instead spoke about the necessity for Kundalini to descend after it reaches the abode of Sahasrara into the heart. And heart not as a heart center, not as a psychic center, but as the Hrid or Hridayam, through that formidable pathway of energy known as the, I forgot, not Ananda Nadi, Amrita Nadi. Down through Amrita Nadi, descend into the heart, which Ramana Maharshi located slightly off the center to the right. If we look into the work of Kundalini Vidya, there's a lesser known, much lesser known school originating from India, which has its representative in the States, Joan Harrigan. He's a trained Swami, trained by a yogi and a spiritual teacher from India. I do not recall his name exactly now, but it might come. They locate that Hrid on the left side of the body. So we already begin to have different perspectives here. Whereas there is another additional center, which is known as the seat of Manas. And according to Kundalini Vidya, this is also a possible descent for Kundalini upon the ascent into the higher centers. So already there is a difference we can see. For Ramana Maharshi, the culmination was not in the ascent into the highest, right, chakra of pure bliss. It then required to go down and descend into the Hrid center, into the heart, where, according to Ramana Maharshi, is the only way that individualized consciousness Kundalini represents can truly die. This prolific and brilliant writer, Robert Svoboda, who is known as for his workshops on Ayurveda now, these days, but he also authored some really amazing books, and his trilogy, Agora trilogy, made of 3 books, where he narrated the story of his time with his spiritual mentor, Agori Vimalananda. He speaks of he defines the ego as his mentor has defined the ego for the sake of this understanding in terms of its relationship with Kundalini. Ego is simply spoken of as that portion of Kundalini which identifies with the body. Body here is spoken in Indian terms. India never views the body as a physiological conglomerate. Whenever India speaks of the body, it means the body that with all its psychosomatic repository. So therefore, this perspective here that Ramana Maharshi exalted is very, very interesting one, so that Kundalini ceases to be Kundalini, or ceases to be that force which keeps in check that sense of identity. That it always intact unless it is dissolved in its sinking into the heart, where the so-called knot is being cut loose, the knot of identity with the body. But Ramakrishna did not see this as a culmination. He clearly saw this as a culmination into the higher spheres. He spoke about also Sahasrara as extending upwards and upwards in his discourses, in his experiences. That he spoke about Sahasrara being a whole area, and not just as it's described in some of this yogic literature. Now, Sri Aurobindo took another perspective altogether, which we greatly share, because in our analysis, it is the closest to our experience and closest to the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism in terms of the final goal of self-realization. What is the most interesting here and the most valid is the final goal. What is the goal of self-realization? Is the goal of self-realization to abide in the transcendent? And if that is, then householder way of life is inferior. Therefore, we have to somehow make do with that. We somehow have to settle on that and hope for the next life. Because it's, in this scenario, the life that we live has no purpose. And that is the teaching of Adi Shankara, by the way. In India, they say, in the intellectual, when I say intellectual spiritual intellectual circles. They say, if not for Abhinavagupta, Indian culture might have been derailed by the unapologetic teachings of Adi Shankara, who seen creative process as nothing other than violational force of karma. Just ponder on that. According to Adi Shankara, everything, absolutely everything, fell under the category of that force, of that pull. So any creative impulse we had, any creative impulse, it's on the account of some samskaras and vasanas playing themselves out, to be eradicated. Whereas Abhinavagupta, completely 2 centuries after, completely gave a different spin on this. That the whole purpose of self-realization is not to abide in transcendence, but to bring that transcendence, that eminence, smack into the center and epicenter of life, so as to enjoy the very drama of life just as Shiva does it, and for which this whole creation is his body. So speaking of, or going back to the Sri Aurobindo had this model. It was spoken as a model, as the model where he constantly spoke, not just in his letters on yoga, but in his more mature later writings, on the necessity of bringing the 2 different traditions, that of Vedantics and that of Tantrikas. He wanted to reunite this rupture that existed in India between these distinctive 2 approaches. He wanted to unite this, what could be seen as that philosophical, that jnani, the man of wisdom, the man of knowledge, and that vijnani, that who lives directly in the presence of bliss, of his own, the Shakti man. And he spoke about the trajectory of the awakening and trajectory of the realization as in terms of what we spoke about in our own discourses here, as descent of grace, ascent of force, and descent to take over the faculties by ennobling them down to the cellular level. So this was the, if you will, the grand idea of Sri Aurobindo, that enlightenment is a culmination of that return. Enlightenment is not for the sake of abiding in a transcendence, but to literally divinize matter. These are actually Sri Aurobindo's words. To make matter divine again, because it became deprived of these divine qualities in the course of evolution. So in other words, matter became matter, and we live in a time when it needs to be divinized, but it cannot be divinized in terms of the conceptualizing, looking at the ocean, mountains, trees, animals, butterflies, insects, what have you, right? Quarks, and just say, oh, it's divine, everything is divine. No, it needs to be actually brought to the level of where that transcendental field is now lived through the senses. And that would amount, and only that would amount for bringing that divine touch back to what becoming more and more and more deprived of these qualities. Maharishi done that. He continued that work and brought it to the culmination with, as you know very well, more than anyone else here perhaps, the culmination of this Vedic approach that the whole human physiology is the expression of all the laws of nature, Ved. Aham Vedam is a lesser known aphorism. There's Shiva Aham, right? Aham Brahmasmi, but it's also Aham Vedam, I'm Veda, I'm knowledge. It's the recognition that all this is structured throughout my neurophysiology. And through the work of his successor, Tony Nader, who is known today also as Adhiraj Rajaram, whose brilliant work under direct guidance of Maharishi to bring direct analogy of all the Vedic literature in its correlation to all the aspects of human physiology, completed that work. So in other words, this work has been completed already in the 20th century. The anthropomorphic idea of the Purusha, that Adam Kadman, that man is in the center of the universe, is being brought back now even through the work of neuroscientists. Whether this gained the momentum, whether this captivated the scientific community, we've seen that it's been slow on the taking. But the interest in that direction is there, clearly. Clearly is there. Some, in my view, much I don't want to say ordinary, that's not the right term. In a less spectacular way of how this has been expounded, there are many teachers in that field almost becoming and branching out as spiritual teachers. Like Joe Dispenza is one of them, who healed himself, who was always neurophysiologist, he was a neuroscientist, and through the fact that he'd gone through this firsthand, he now offering workshops based on his now understanding of the internal nature of the process. Both. I have the great suspect that he has propped up his understanding also from scriptural references, from the point of view, and this is what gave him that confidence to go out now and hold these workshops, not just write books about it, not just speak about his recovery and how this can be applied. So, what is enlightenment? What happens to Kundalini? So, if Kundalini is indeed our consciousness, and that what is here one and the only agency or agent for experiencing this, what we are, then it cannot be kind of stabilized. That analogy Ramana Maharshi gave, that it dies in the heart, again, to be taken not at a face value, but to be taken as a metaphor. As a metaphor. Kundalini cannot die. It's simply transformed now fully. Consciousness is now fully integrated. And in Kashmir Shaivism, there is this very rich and refined perspective on the process of Kundalini. And it culminates in this realization on the full ascent. In a full ascent, Kundalini ascends to the throne and resides in the higher regions. Now, this is only a matter of perspective. Descending down into the heart, this dimension doesn't exist. Hrid, or the higher regions, can be seen as belonging to the same realm. It's just a matter of perception, matter of perspective rather. It's no longer a matter of different spatial directions. So just as above the Sahasrara, that experience can be experienced through the descent into the heart through the Amrita Nadi. But one way or the other, Kashmir Shaivism has this perspective where Kundalini, after all this unfoldment, becomes on the throne of creation. And that is the perspective. This is forever new, forever virgin, forever, this is the immortality of the soul. It's just to give you a glimpse of how, in the esoteric perspectives of Kashmir Shaivism, the process itself seen and culminates. So, make what you can out of it. But there is no such thing as, because if not feeling Kundalini means not feeling anything. Because what ignites everything, what makes us feel anything, is charged by that force. So it's too abstract affair that this somehow settles down and then pure consciousness abides in the body. Then the question is, how does it abide in the body? It can only abide in the body as life force. And it cannot abide in the body by ignoring, let alone violating its own laws of creation. So therefore, spirit in the body moves not in a way that is like, some that spiritual anatomy is just as much relevant to highly evolved being, and it's just as much relevant to any being, anyone. So,
well, I think what I meant by that Kundalini is that it's that wild, energetic expression of it, that in my case anyway has ceased. I still feel currents.
It doesn't matter. It's like you now your mind reaches explanations, my dear. Your mind wants some confirmation, some explanation. And Hafiz had, the Persian poet? He had brush with awakening in his tender youth. And then it's gone. And then he spent the rest of his life writing an amazing poetry. What Hafiz is known for, right? And constantly this love and the beloved, Hafiz has a nickname, the sweetest nightingale of Persian language. It's his, just like among the jazzmen, they give each other nicknames, like Blackbird, right? You know who was Blackbird? Do you remember? No? That's the nickname for Miles Davis. Not Charlie Parker.
No, Charlie Parker's yard.
Huh?
Yeah, Miles Davis, Black.
Yes, the movie was Birdie. The movie by him.
So about
His name Birdie by Clint Eastwood.
exactly. Charlie Parker? Yeah. So Blackbird was Bye Bye Blackbird. Yeah, that's the song about he's saying goodbye to Charlie Parker. Caught you.
Yeah.
Caught you. So this Hafiz story is quite telling. All the poetry we have was written in that state of lamenting for the state of union, for the state of unity, lamenting for it, having a taste and it's gone. Can you believe it? And then we have Hafiz, and at the age of 80, just when he stopped drinking, because he was also, it was very tricky with Hafiz, like a truly psychosomatic. All his poetry has this metaphor of cup and wine, and cup and wine, and more cups and more wine. And then he goes into the tavern and really gets pissed, and completely completely, like a Hafiz lost his way home, that. Completely. I even had like some of my own rumblings there, But, Farishta will carry me home. Anyway, but at the age of 80, he truly, truly has this experience, stabilized experience of unity, to speak that transcendental meditation language, right? He has this stabilized experience of unity, and then no poetry coming through. So we no longer have Hafiz. The sweetest nightingale no longer sings his song.
Yeah, he said in one of his poems that his master used to tease him that he was so pregnant, and when are you going to give birth? You're so, and he used to get sort of annoyed at this reference of him being constantly referred to as being pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When is it going to happen?
So, you see, mind can just quietly settle on something like, okay, I went through this, it was wild, it was tumultuous, spectacular, this. So I've gone with that, I'm past that. Remember what we spoke this morning about before meditation? Beginner's mind.
Yes.
Beginner's mind. Therefore I felt like speaking out loud that short, beautiful line by Lala of Kashmir. Right? The soul, like a moon, is now and always new. So this, nothing with reference to what happened. Forget about what happened. Yes, spiritual autobiography, you write that, you put it there. But not with reference to what happened. Current state of affairs. Current state of affairs.
Well, when I close my eyes, there's no questions. It's only when you open the eyes and start talking to your friends. Questions start to come.
All right, well
When you
then,
close your eyes,
you have a hint there and then.
it's pretty clear. Just one more.
No more. You have a hint there. You just spoke it. See? Take a deep breath when you want to speak and see what happens. And then you want to speak again, take a deep breath. And see what happens. See that? Language conceals reality. Language conceals reality. Constantly. Through these concepts, direct experience is not a concept. Direct experience is a continuity of cognition. It is beyond the language. Therefore, all sages are poets, all without exception. Every true sage is a poet in the heart. Because only when language becomes closer, some way, to poetry, it can have ability to touch that. But casually spoken language are vikalpas reinforced. Vikalpas reinforced. It takes tremendous amount of awareness to be aware of that. And then, of course, we will slip and slip back into that. And it will reinforce itself, reinforce itself. Therefore, periodically taking break from excessive speaking is very, very good. Very good.